Everyone in my neighborhood thought I was crazy. They laughed every time I carried supplies into my basement. Some even warned their kids to stay away from me. 3 weeks later, those same people were begging me to open my door. I never imagined it would come to that, but looking back now, I think some part of me always knew it would. My name is Rebecca Hill. I'm 55 years old, and I've lived alone on Maple Hollow Court for almost 11 years now. My husband passed a long time ago, and my daughter moved across the country for work, so it's just me, this house, and my routines. I never minded the quiet. What I minded, if I'm honest, was the way people looked at me whenever I pulled into my driveway with the trunk of my car loaded down with water jugs, batteries, canned goods, and first aid kits. I could feel their eyes on me from behind their curtains, from their porches, from their perfectly mowed lawns. I heard the whispers even when they thought I couldn't. Mike Sanders lived 2 houses down from me with his wife Donna and their 2 kids, Tyler and Zoe. Mike was the kind of man who considered himself the unofficial mayor of the block, always organizing barbecues, always the loudest voice at the community meetings. He was the first one to start calling me the bunker lady. He said it with a laugh, like it was the funniest thing in the world, and pretty soon everyone else picked it up too. Even little Zoe, who couldn't have been more than 8 years old, would giggle and whisper it to her friends whenever I walked past with my grocery bags full of canned beans and bottled water. I never went to the block parties. I know that made things worse, in a way. Donna used to send her older son Tyler over with invitations, cheerful little flyers with balloons drawn on them, and I always said thank you, and I always stayed home. It wasn't that I disliked my neighbors. I just knew that if I went, I'd spend the whole evening fielding questions about why my windows were always shut, why I never seemed to sit outside, why I disappeared into my basement for hours at a time carrying boxes that rattled and clinked. I didn't want to explain myself to people who had already decided what kind of woman I was. There was also Frank Delgado, an older widower who lived across the street. Frank was different from the others. He never mocked me outright, but he'd raise an eyebrow whenever he saw me hauling in another case of water, and he'd say things like, "Expecting the end of the world, Rebecca?" With that dry little smile of his. I'd just nod and keep walking. I didn't owe anyone an explanation, not even kind old Frank. And then there was the young couple who just moved in that spring, Chris and Amanda Reyes. They had a baby girl named Lily, barely 6 months old, and Amanda used to watch me from her front window with this puzzled, almost pitying expression, like she thought I was a sad, lonely woman who filled the emptiness of her life with paranoia and canned soup. I caught her telling Donna once, in a voice she probably thought I couldn't hear, "I feel bad for her. She must be so scared of everything." I wanted to tell her that fear wasn't what drove me. It was the opposite of fear. It was clarity. Every week, without fail, I made my trip to the hardware store and the supermarket. Water, always water, because you can survive weeks without food but only days without clean water. Batteries in every size, because flashlights and radios are useless without power. Canned goods that wouldn't spoil, jars of peanut butter, bags of rice and beans that could last for years if stored properly. First aid kits with real supplies, not just Band-Aids and aspirin, but antiseptics, bandages, medications for fever and pain. A generator I'd bought secondhand and fixed up myself, because I refused to depend on the power company or on anyone else to keep my lights on. Fuel canisters stored safely in a ventilated corner of my basement. Flashlights and lanterns and hand crank radios. Blankets, so many blankets, because when the temperature drops and the heat goes out, warmth becomes the most precious thing in the world. The kids on the street used to ride their bikes past my house just to get a look at what I was carrying inside. Tyler and his friends would sometimes stop right at the edge of my driveway, pretending to fix their bike chains, just to watch me struggle a heavy box through my front door. Once, I heard one of them say, "My dad says she thinks the apocalypse is coming." Another boy laughed and said, "The apocalypse isn't coming, she's just crazy." I remember standing there in my doorway, the box heavy in my arms, and just letting the words wash over me. I'd heard worse. I'd hear worse still. Some of them even filmed me. I saw a boy, maybe 12 years old, holding up his phone as I walked from my car to my front door with 2 gallons of water in each hand. I didn't say anything. I never said anything. I just kept walking, kept stacking, kept preparing, because I had learned a long time ago that you cannot argue someone out of their comfort. Comfort is a powerful drug, and most people would rather laugh at the woman who breaks a sweat preparing for disaster than admit that disaster is always closer than we think. I want to be clear about something. I wasn't preparing because I believed in some specific catastrophe. I didn't have a vision or a premonition. I simply understood, the way you understand gravity, that the world does not owe any of us safety. Storms happen. Power grids fail. Supply chains break down faster than people realize. I had read about hurricanes that left entire towns without electricity for weeks, about ice storms that trapped families in their homes with no heat, about floods that swallowed neighborhoods that never saw it coming because nobody warned them, or because they were warned and didn't listen. I decided a long time ago that I would rather be laughed at for being ready than be caught helpless when the moment came. That decision cost me my place in the neighborhood's easy circle of friendship. It cost me invitations to birthday parties and holiday dinners. It cost me a reputation. But it never once cost me my peace of mind. The first sign that something was coming arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in late September. I remember because I was in the middle of rotating my water supply, checking expiration dates, when the emergency alert buzzed on my phone. Meteorologists were tracking a storm system forming far out over the ocean, and within a day, the warnings grew more serious. They were calling it a hurricane unlike anything the region had seen in decades, with wind speeds that could tear roofs from houses and rainfall that could flood streets in a matter of hours. I watched the news that night with a kind of grim calm settling over me. I'd seen this pattern before, storms that formed and dissolved, warnings that never quite materialized into anything serious. But something about the tone of the meteorologists, the way their voices tightened, the way they kept repeating the words unprecedented and extremely dangerous, told me this one was different. I walked around the neighborhood the next morning, not to warn anyone, because I already knew how that would go, but just to see how people were reacting. Mike was out mowing his lawn like it was any other Wednesday. Donna was hanging string lights for some upcoming get-together. Chris was washing his car in the driveway while baby Lily napped inside. Nobody was boarding up windows. Nobody was buying extra water. When I passed by, Frank called out from his porch, only half joking. "Guess your bunker's about to get some use, huh, Rebecca?" I gave him a small smile and kept walking. I didn't say what I was thinking, which was that I hoped, more than anything, that he was wrong. The storm hit 2 nights later, and it hit hard. I remember lying in bed listening to the wind build from a low moan into something that sounded almost alive, something that shook the windows in their frames and sent branches cracking down onto rooftops across the street. Around midnight, the power went out. I felt the house go silent in that particular way that only happens when the refrigerator hum and the electrical buzz you never notice suddenly disappear. I got up, lit one of my lanterns, and made my way down to the basement, not out of panic, but out of habit. Everything was exactly where it needed to be. By morning, the full scope of the damage was impossible to ignore. The hurricane had brought flooding the likes of which our street had never seen. Water pooled in yards and crept up driveways. Trees had fallen across power lines, snapping them in half, and the road at the end of our block was completely submerged, cutting us off from the main highway. Cell towers had been damaged in the storm, so phone service was spotty at best, and for many people on the street, completely dead. There was no way to call for help, no way to check the news, no way to know how long the outage would last or when rescue crews might reach us. I stepped outside that first morning and looked at my neighborhood, and it was almost unrecognizable. Donna's string lights lay tangled and torn in her yard. Mike's carefully mowed lawn was a swamp of mud and debris. The Reyes family's car, The one Chris had washed so carefully 2 days earlier had a tree branch resting across its windshield. People wandered out of their homes in a kind of daze, looking at the wreckage, looking at each other, looking, I noticed, occasionally toward my house. It took about a day and a half for the reality to fully sink in for most of my neighbors. The stores nearby had no power to run their registers, and even the ones that stayed open ran out of bottled water within hours. Nobody had food that didn't require refrigeration or cooking. Nobody had a way to charge their phones. The nights were the hardest, Donna told me later, because the darkness was so complete, and the cold crept into houses that had no heat and no way to keep it out. I heard, secondhand, that people started talking. Someone, I think it might have been Frank, said out loud what everyone else had been quietly thinking. He said, "There's only one person on this street who saw this coming." And slowly, hesitantly, people began making their way to my door. Mike came first, I remember, looking sheepish in a way I'd never seen from him before, holding Tyler's hand, with Zoe trailing behind clutching a stuffed rabbit. He didn't say much. He just asked, quietly, if I had any water to spare, and whether I knew anything about when the power might come back. Donna came not long after, her eyes red from lack of sleep, asking if I had a way to charge her phone so she could reach her sister in another state. Then came the Reyes family, Chris carrying little Lily bundled in blankets because their apartment had grown too cold overnight, and Amanda, the same woman who had once called me pitiful through her window, standing on my porch with tears in her eyes, asking if there was anything at all, I could do to help keep her daughter warm. I opened my basement door. Inside was everything I had spent years gathering, mocked for, filmed for, whispered about behind cupped hands. The generator roared to life and I ran a line to power a small space heater and few charging stations. I handed out gallons of water, one by one, to people who used to laugh when they saw me carrying them into my house. I opened cases of canned food and helped Donna heat soup on a small camp stove. I pulled out extra blankets, warm and clean, folded neatly from years of preparation, and wrapped them around Lily, around Zoe, around Frank's thin shoulders as he sat quietly in my kitchen looking, for the first time since I'd known him, humbled. I didn't say anything about the laughing. I didn't remind Mike about the nickname his family had given me, or bring up the video some kid had taken of me hauling groceries into my house. It wasn't the moment for that, and honestly, it never really was. I just kept helping, kept handing out supplies, kept checking on the older folks on the block who couldn't manage the cold as well as the rest of us, kept making sure the children had enough to eat and something warm to sleep under. My house, once the subject of ridicule, became something like a shelter for the entire street over the next several days, while crews worked to clear the roads and restore power. By the time the electricity finally came back on, nearly 5 days later, word had spread beyond our little corner of the neighborhood. A local news crew came by to cover the recovery efforts, and one of the emergency responders, a tired-looking man in a reflective vest, stood in my driveway and told the reporter, on camera, that without Rebecca, this neighborhood would have suffered far greater losses. I stood off to the side, out of the shot, watching my neighbors nod along in agreement, watching Mike's face soften into something like genuine gratitude, watching Amanda hold her daughter a little tighter as she listened. Things didn't change overnight after that. I didn't suddenly become the most popular person on Maple Hollow Court, and honestly, I didn't want to be. But something shifted. Donna started stopping by just to check in on me, not out of obligation, but because she seemed to actually want to. Tyler and Zoe wave at me now instead of whispering behind their hands. Frank still teases me sometimes about my bunker, but there's no bite to it anymore, just a kind of quiet respect passed between two people who've learned something about each other. Amanda brought Lily by a few weeks later, just to say thank you, and we sat on my porch, the same porch I used to sit on alone, and talked for almost an hour. I think about those weeks often, the years of quiet mockery followed by those few days when everything I had built in secret became the only thing standing between my neighbors and real suffering. I don't say this to feel superior to anyone. I understand why they laughed. Most people don't think about disaster until it's standing on their doorstep, and there's a kind of innocence in that, even if it's a dangerous one. I was simply the person who couldn't stop thinking about it, who couldn't shake the feeling that safety is never guaranteed, and who decided, long before anyone else on the street, that being ready was worth being misunderstood. The people you laugh at today may be the ones who save you tomorrow. I didn't choose to be different. I just chose to be prepared, and somewhere along the way, those two things became the same thing in the eyes of my neighbors. Have you ever judged someone too quickly, only to realize later just how wrong you were?